All right, buckle up. Today we're diving headfirst into one of history's most intense chapters, the Cold War. And we're going way beyond just battles and deeds, folks.
Yeah, we're going to get into the strategies, the psychological games, even moments that could totally reshape the world as we know it.
It's a period that, even decades later, I think, still has this power to fascinate us and maybe even terrify us a little bit, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, most people probably know it as that big standoff between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but it was so much bigger than just those two.
Yeah, that whole cold part of the name, that's really key here. We didn't see these huge direct clashes between the US and the Soviet Union.
Right?
But the world was absolutely a chessboard. I mean, think about it. Conflicts were erupting everywhere, from Korea, Vietnam, even Afghanistan.
Exactly, and those are just a few.
These were proxy wars, right?
Yeah.
So these battles were being fought by other countries, but the fuel, the driving force behind them was that fundamental ideological clash between these two massive blocs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got the U.S. leading the Western Bloc, pushing for capitalism and liberal democracy, and on the other side, you have the Soviet Union. They were all about communism and a command economy, and that formed the Eastern Bloc. And it wasn't just some theoretical debate happening in smoky back rooms. This stuff played out in every single aspect of life. How economies worked, how nations aligned themselves. I mean, everything.
And this is where things get really interesting, at least for me. Early on, the U.S. adopted the strategy called containment, basically a way to keep Soviet influence boxed in, stop it from spreading.
Right.
And we're talking major moves here.
Right.
The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. Think about it. Billions of dollars poured into Western Europe. And, it wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts.
Right.
This was about making those nations strong, resilient to, those communist ideas.
Yeah. And a really interesting thing that people often don't realize is how the U.S. approached Germany. On the surface, they said they totally supported a unified Germany. But behind the scenes, it was a different story. They were actually maneuvering to prevent that from happening.
Wait, really? Why would they do that?
Well, they were worried, right? A neutral, unified Germany, it might just swing over to the Soviet sphere of influence.
Yeah.
I think it just shows you how incredibly high the stakes were, how carefully every single move had to be planned out.
It really does sound like a global chess match, each side constantly trying to predict what the other one's going to do next.
Oh, absolutely.
And then you add this whole other layer, the world of espionage. It was like a whole secret war happening in the shadows.
Oh, yeah.
The CIA and the KGB, they were locked in this constant back and forth. Atomic spies trying to steal top secret information, double agents playing both sides, and disinformation campaigns designed to just sow chaos and confusion.
And the impact of all that espionage, I mean, it was huge. The Soviets, they actually managed to infiltrate the U.S. Manhattan Project. Think about that. They sped up their own atomic bomb development by years because of it. And when they detonated their first bomb in 1949, you can bet that sent shockwaves through the West.
I bet it did.
It was a wake-up call. The nuclear arms race, it had officially begun.
Yeah.
And the stakes, well, they just went through the roof.
Honestly, it's almost impossible for me to even imagine the tension of that time, Just knowing that these incredibly destructive weapons were actually in play. And then you throw in these disinformation campaigns, it must have been a very uneasy time to live through.
It was. And the KGB, they were masters of manipulating information, really. They were trying to destabilize the West from within.
It was like a war on multiple fronts.
It was. To counter that, the West relied a lot on radio broadcasts. Radio Free Europe, for example, they were trying to break through that Soviet information blockade, offering another perspective to people living on the other side of the Iron Curtain. Of course, the Soviets tried to jam those signals.
Oh, I bet they did.
But, the message still got through. It's hard to completely block out the truth.
It's really amazing how people find ways to communicate even in the toughest circumstances. And speaking of division, I think there's no better place to understand that than Berlin. This city, physically divided in two.
Right.
It really became a microcosm of the entire Cold War.
Oh, absolutely.
It all started with the Berlin blockade back in 1948. Stalin, this guy was serious. He wanted to force the West out of Berlin, so he decided to cut off all land access to West Berlin.
Right, essentially trying to starve them into submission.
But the response from the West, it was incredible. They launched the Berlin airlift. They flew in supplies day after day for almost a year.
A monumental effort. Imagine the logistics of that.
It's mind-boggling. Over 2 million tons of food, fuel, medicine, everything they needed. They even flew in candy, Pilots would drop sweets for the children. People called it Operation Vittles. It was a powerful message. It showed just how committed the West was to West Berlin. It wasn't just about the supplies. It was about hope, about defiance.
It was a huge propaganda victory for the West.
Yeah.
It really showed their resolve. It highlighted the stark contrast between their system and the Soviet system. But the division in Berlin, it only intensified in 1961 when they built the Berlin Wall.
The Berlin Wall, it sliced right through the heart of the city, didn't it?
It did. Divided families, friends.
It became this stark symbol of communist oppression. It's hard to imagine the desperation people must have felt trapped on the eastern side, and the risks they took, those dangerous attempts to escape.
The Berlin Wall, it embodied so many of the fears that defined that era. The fear of the other, the fear of being trapped, and always that looming fear of nuclear war, which, was constantly fueled by the arms race.
That arms race was terrifying, just a constant contest for nuclear dominance. It wasn't even just about building bigger and bigger bombs. It was about proving technological superiority. And it really bled into every aspect of their rivalry. I mean, take the space race, for example, that was sparked by the Soviets launching Sputnik in 1957.
Right, the first artificial satellite.
And the U.S. felt this immense pressure to catch up, to surpass them. You can just imagine the anxiety, right? The fate of the world felt like it was resting on who had the bigger rocket.
And then in 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world literally held its breath. I mean, the Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
Wow, that's close.
Right. It was a gamble, a really daring move. Honestly, nearly pushes over the edge.
I can't even imagine.
President Kennedy, he responded with a naval blockade, demanding that they remove those missiles. And for 13 agonizing days, the world teetered on the brink of nuclear war.
13 days.
Yeah, and what's truly chilling is we later found out that Castro, the leader of Cuba, he was willing to use those missiles if the U.S. invaded.
Oh, wow.
It's a lot to take in, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it forced both superpowers to confront just how terrifying their rivalry had become.
Yeah.
We stared into the abyss, and we came out shaken, but maybe, just maybe, a little bit wiser. After that Cuban Missile Crisis, things had to change. I mean, it really underlined how urgent it was to find some way to manage this rivalry, to prevent another close call like that.
Yeah, it must felt like the whole world was holding its breath for those 13 days. And then we see this period of détente emerge in the early 1970s.
Right.
It was a real effort to try to thaw relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So we're talking negotiations, arms control agreements like SALT, the strategic arms limitation talks.
Yeah.
They were trying to put some kind of limits on that terrifying nuclear arms race.
Right. Yeah. President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they really embraced what's called realpolitik, a kind of pragmatic approach to foreign policy. And it led to some pretty surprising moves, like opening relations with China.
Yeah, I was going to say, that was a big one. It felt like, a little glimmer of hope in this long and honestly really scary conflict.
It was. But, détente wasn't a magic solution.
Right.
I mean, proxy wars are still happening, especially in the developing world, where all these newly independent nations kind of became pawns in this superpower struggle.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the Vietnam War, which had been escalating through the 1960s, that became a really stark example of that. It was a major turning point for the U.S.
Absolutely. The Vietnam War, it exposed the limits of U.S. power, and it really fueled all that anti-war sentiment back home. And it also, it highlighted how complicated the dynamics were within the communist world itself. I mean, the Soviets were supporting North Vietnam, yeah, but they were also kind of wary of China's growing influence in the region. So even within that communist bloc, things weren't so simple.
It seems like every time there was a chance for things to get better, something would happen to pull everyone right back into that tension and distrust.
Yeah, you're right. It was a really fragile piece. And in the late 1970s, things started to unravel. I mean, there were a few factors that contributed to it, but the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, that was a real turning point.
It was a pretty costly miscalculation for the Soviets, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it triggered international condemnation. President Carter pulled the U.S. out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, imposed sanctions. It marked a real return to a more confrontational relationship. That fragile peace was over.
And then, 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected president of the U.S.
Right, a staunch anti-communist.
I mean, this guy famously called the Soviet Union an evil empire. And he really ramped up U.S. military spending. It was a much more assertive, hawkish foreign policy.
Oh, yeah.
And His rhetoric, it was powerful, even provocative at times. I mean, he proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was quickly nicknamed Star Wars.
Yeah.
It was this idea for a space-based missile defense system that would, theoretically shield the U.S. from a nuclear attack. You can see why the Soviets saw that as a threat.
Oh, absolutely. It was a direct challenge to their capabilities.
Yeah.
The early 1980s, it was a really tense time. Some historians even call it the Second Cold War. But even with all this confrontation, there were these unexpected moments that sort of revealed the human side of this conflict. Like, for instance, in 1983, this 10-year-old American girl, Samantha Smith, she wrote a letter to Yuri Andropov. He was the Soviet leader at the time.
Oh, yeah, I remember hearing about that. What was it about?
Well, she was expressing her fears about nuclear war. And Andropov actually wrote back. He invited her to visit the Soviet Union. Her trip, I mean, it became a media sensation, this symbol of citizen diplomacy, It showed that yearning for peace that existed on both sides. Kind of a reminder that this whole conflict wasn't just about ideologies and weapons. It was about people and about shared anxieties, this desire for a future without that threat of, total annihilation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to forget, I think, the human cost of all of this, the fear that must have been just woven into everyday life. And speaking of fear, that same year, 1983, there were two really chilling incidents that showed just how close we came to disaster.
Right. First, you have the Soviets shooting down Korean Airlines Flight 007.
Oh, right.
They thought it was a U.S. spy plane, but it was a civilian airliner. All 269 people on board were killed.
Oh, it was a horrible tragedy.
Yeah, it really inflamed tensions. Reagan condemned the Soviets, called it a massacre, and while the U.S. was dealing with that, the Soviets were facing their own near catastrophe, a false alarm incident that almost triggered a nuclear retaliation.
Wow, I don't think I've heard about that one. What happened?
It was September of 1983. A Soviet early warning system, it malfunctioned. It indicated that the U.S. had launched multiple nuclear missiles. It must have been terrifying. And it came down to one man, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov, to make a decision. I mean, a life or death decision.
So he was the one who had to decide whether to believe the alarm.
Yeah, can you imagine the pressure?
Yeah.
And thankfully, he had the courage to question it. He assessed it as a false alarm. And because of him, they didn't launch a counterattack. I mean, that could have been catastrophic.
It's incredible. I mean, this guy, Stanislav Petrov, he basically saved the world. But as the 1980s went on, it became clearer and clearer that the Soviet Union was really struggling.
Oh, yeah. The system was strained. Their economy was stagnant. They couldn't keep up with the West. The war in Afghanistan was draining their resources, their morale. Plus, the Soviet leadership was aging. There was this growing sense that something had to give, both within the USSR and in those satellite states.
And that's where Mikhail Gorbachev comes in.
Exactly. Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, and he inherited a system in crisis. He knew they needed reform, and introduced these two key policies, glasnost and perestroika.
Okay, so break those down for me. Glasnost, that meant openness, right? Kind of a move away from all that secrecy that had always defined the Soviet system.
Exactly. Glasnost was about increasing transparency in government, allowing more freedom of expression. It was a huge shift.
And perestroika, that was about restructuring the Soviet economy.
Yeah, perestroika was about trying to revitalize their economy, introducing some market-oriented reforms. Basically, a move away from that rigid, centralized planning that had been stifling everything.
These were big changes for the Soviet Union. How did the West react?
Well, at first there was a lot of skepticism. I mean, a lot of Western leaders thought Gorbachev's reforms were just a trick, a way to kind of strengthen the Soviet system without really changing anything. But as he pressed forward, it became clear that he was serious about reform.
And that openness, that willingness to engage with the West did have an impact, didn't it?
It did. Gorbachev and President Reagan started having these high-profile summits. The first one was in Geneva in 1985. They had these really frank discussions about arms control and other issues, and they developed a rapport, which really helped to thaw relations.
It must have been pretty amazing to see these two guys who for so long had embodied that Cold War rivalry, standing together, talking, trying to find common ground.
It really was. And a signal that the Cold War was entering a new phase, one that was marked by dialogue and a real willingness to try to find solutions. And this new spirit of cooperation led to a landmark agreement in 1987, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, or INF Treaty.
The INF Treaty was huge. I mean, this wasn't just about limiting weapons. This was about getting rid of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It was the first agreement to eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons. The U.S. and the Soviet Union had to destroy all of their ground-launched intermediate-range nuclear missiles. It was a real, concrete step towards nuclear disarmament. It felt like the Cold War might actually be winding down.
And that momentum for change just kept building, especially in Europe, where Gorbachev's policies had a huge impact. The Soviet Union's grip on Eastern Europe was loosening.
Oh, yeah. Gorbachev's reforms, combined with all the economic and social pressures that were building in the Eastern Bloc, it led to a wave of protests and demands for change. And then, in 1989, we saw these revolutions sweep across Eastern Europe. Communist regimes were toppled. The Iron Curtain was being dismantled.
And then, of course, that iconic moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Incredible, wasn't it? Broadcast all over the world, people chipping away at that wall, crossing freely between East and West Berlin for the first time in decades. The Berlin Wall, that symbol of oppression and division, it was crumbling. And with it, the Soviet Empire was starting to unravel.
It all led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in 1991. It's amazing how such a powerful empire could collapse so quickly.
It really was a swift unraveling.
Yeah.
Fueled by all those internal pressures, economic woes, and the loss of control over its satellite states. Gorbachev, he actually played a key role. He refused to use force to try to suppress the independence movements in the republics. He seemed to realize that the Soviet Union, it just couldn't be held together by force anymore.
It must have felt like the end of an era, the end of this decades-long struggle. But what does it all mean? How do we make sense of the end of the Cold War?
The end of the Cold War, it marked a huge shift in global power. The U.S. emerged as the sole superpower, and the world entered a new era, an era full of both promise and uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like we traded in one set of global worries for a whole new set. The threat of nuclear war, yeah, that seemed to fade away. But all these new challenges popped up. Terrorism, cyber attacks, the rise of new global powers.
Exactly. It's not like we reached some perfect end of history after the Cold War. I mean, things are probably even more complex now. That old system where it was just two superpowers facing off, that's gone. Now it's this multipolar world with alliances constantly shifting, new power centers emerging. But, the Cold War's legacy, it's still there, woven into everything.
Yeah, it really makes you think about how those decades of rivalry shaped so much of what we see today. I mean, the institutions, the alliances, the global economy, even just the way we think about things like democracy, freedom, security.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine those things separate from the Cold War's influence.
Yeah.
And for a lot of countries, that transition from communism to democracy and market economies, well, it was rocky. Think about the former Yugoslavia,
Right.
those brutal ethnic wars that broke out in the 1990s. And then you see the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism in some of those former Soviet republics. I think it's a reminder that the end of the Cold War didn't automatically flip a switch and make the world more democratic.
It makes you wonder, did we actually learn anything from this era? I mean, all that rivalry, that tension, those moments where it felt like we were right on the edge of nuclear war. Can we take those lessons and apply them to what we're facing now? I mean, like dealing with the rise of China or the threat of nuclear proliferation.
Those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? One thing the Cold War shows us is just how dangerous ideological extremism can be. It can make you blind to the nuances, make compromise seem impossible. And it also highlights how important clear communication is. We need ways to prevent misunderstandings, especially when you're talking about countries with nuclear weapons, like setting up that hotline between Washington and Moscow after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a good step.
Yeah, and it's not just about avoiding those worst-case scenarios. It's also about remembering the human costs of these global power struggles. Think about all the proxy wars during the Cold War. Millions of people were killed or displaced. And for decades, so many people lived with this constant fear, this fear that the world could end at any moment.
It's a heavy thought. It reminds us that peace, whether it's global or personal, it's something fragile. It takes constant work, It's easy to fall back into those old ways of thinking, seeing things as black and white, us versus them. But the Cold War, it's a cautionary tale.
It really is. And it makes us think about those big questions about ideology, power, the choices we make. And those questions, they're just as important now as they were back then. It's like a reminder that history isn't just something in the past, it's something we're living with. It shapes us. It shapes the world around us.
And it reminds us that we're not just watching history unfold. We're part of it, each of us. We all have a role in shaping what comes next. So I think as we look back on this time, all the victories and tragedies, the things we learned, maybe the biggest question we can ask ourselves is, what kind of world do we want to create? What lessons do we want to take from the Cold War? And which ones are we going to leave behind?
That's a great question and a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Cold War. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.